President, earlier this year, I was with a bipartisan delegation, traveled around the Abraham Accords countries. We were in Morocco, we were in Bahrain, we were in UAE, we were in Israel, talking about future advancement for peace. There's great optimism and engagement. There's economic activity, tourist activity. There's a lot of interaction with development on healthcare, on cyber protections, cooperation together for energy and water. Literally families meeting each other, some of them for the first time in generations, to be able to have a conversation about a future in the Middle East based around peace. It was based off of an agreement that started September the 15th of 2020 with the signing of the Abraham Accords and has continued to advance. In fact, just as recently as a month ago, there was outspoken public support from Saudi Arabia and from Israel about advancing a normalization agreement between Saudi Arabia and Israel, what people thought would be unheard of just a few years ago. There was an advance of conversation about how we can increase peace. And then, on the 7th of October, one day after the 50th anniversary of the start of the Yom Kippur War, a group of terrorists from Gaza penetrated the wall separating Gaza and Israel, and they slaughtered 1,400 Israelis, brutally. Many in their bed, children, elderly, disabled, it didn't matter. Whether they were college students at a concert, whether there were people traveling down a highway, or whether it was children literally on their playgrounds, they murdered them where they stood. And then they took hostages and retreated back into Gaza, for some reason assuming that Israel and the world would just not notice their barbarism. Well, the world certainly noticed. And as Americans, we obviously all lived in the shock and horror of the event with the Israelis and the rest of the world. 31 Americans died in that attack, and 13 are missing, presumed to be hostages inside Gaza. Many of those individuals were killed simply because they were Jewish, period. The pain of that has struck all of us over the course of the past several weeks now, and we watch Israel rightly respond to the acts of terrorism, as we have as a nation as well when we were attacked at 9/11. We mobilized our forces. We identified al-Qaeda, and we identified those that were harboring al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, the Taliban, and determined that kind of attack would not happen again. And we as a nation determined we were going to not only stop the capabilities of al-Qaeda to be able to attack us, but we were going to preemptively respond if we were attacked again. Our first goal, though, was to be able to prevent that kind of attack from coming at us again. Israel is entirely right when they have been attacked by a terrorist organization to be able to say that organization cannot do that to our nation again and to our people again. The United States has responded by sending 2 carrier strike groups to the Mediterranean to literally park off the coast of Israel to give a clear signal to Lebanon, to Iran, do not engage in this. We understand fully, as most of the world does, that Hamas is funded by Iran. And while many in the Muslim world, in the Arab countries, continue to be able to speak out on behalf of Palestinians, they also understand 70% of the funding for Hamas comes from Iran. The weapon system that Hamas has right now were fully funded by Iran, and the weapon systems in Lebanon by Hezbollah, where they have been attacking Israel from the north, were fully funded and created and many times shipped directly from Iran. Iran is the destabilizing force in this entire region. And we as Americans have made very, very clear that we understand that Iran is the one who funded this, who supplied the weapon systems, who supplied the training and the munitions. Iran is the one who continues to destabilize that region. And as Americans, we clearly speak out for the protection of all civilians in every nation around the world and in every conflict in the world. But we're also very clear that Israel did not initiate this battle in the last 2 weeks. Hamas did, and they pulled their hostages back into Gaza as they continue to be able to hide them among the civilian population. It is a painful piece for us to be able to see internationally. For us in Oklahoma, we're like many others that are in this chamber as well. It personally affects many families in Oklahoma. Israel is a nation so small that there's no one that's not experienced the pain of a friend, a relative, somebody that they work with. They know people that have been directly attacked. But in my state of Oklahoma, we're in the same condition. Many people that I interact with talk frequently about family, friends that live in Israel or they travel back and forth. Quite frankly, last weekend, I worshiped with a Jewish congregation on Shabbat and heard the dialogue from many people about their travels back and forth and family and friends and what they have personally experienced as a family based on this terrorist attack. Quite frankly, my state of Oklahoma has a very close bond with Israel, as the United States has a very close bond. Close enough that we had many Oklahomans that were currently in Israel during that time of the attacks, and our offices actively worked to be able to help get many of those out, since many flights have been canceled out of Tel Aviv. So we have actively worked to be able to get many of those individuals back home to Oklahoma. And they have quite a story to tell, as you would assume. The pain of this, though, is also something that we should pay attention to. We as a nation not only remember 9/11 in our response, but we also remember 9/11 was instituted by 20 people that were illegally present in the United States. We should not fail to remember that fact as well. Recent statistics coming across our southern border identify in the last 2 years, just the last 2 years, we've had 70,000 individuals that have been identified as what they call special interest aliens. These are individuals that came between the ports of entry that were running through to try to evade being captured. They are identified as special interest aliens because they have this designation. They potentially possess a national security risk to the United States or its interests. So they're identified as a special interest alien. As I mentioned, we've had more than 70,000 of those that have crossed between our ports of entry just in the last 2 years. These are individuals from Syria, from Iran, from Iraq, from Pakistan, from West Africa, from locations where terrorism is known to exist, and we don't have any criminal history of those individuals. If you're thinking, I'm glad we picked them up between ports of entry, well, let me finish the story for you. Most of those 70,000 special interest aliens were identified between the ports of entry and then were released into the country under Biden's policy on how he handles immigration currently. Those 70,000 individuals that were identified as potentially possessing a national security risk to the United States or its interest are in the United States right now. Just in the past week, 4 individuals from Iran were picked up. Multiple Syrians were picked up between our ports of entry and then released, awaiting a hearing in the future. And in current status right now, that hearing will be 8 to 10 years in the future. They're unmonitored. They're wandering around within our borders, awaiting a hearing 8 to 10 years from now in the future, after being identified as a special interest alien. We grieve for Israel, but for some reason, there are some in this body and in the White House that will not pay attention to our own national security issues and the obvious exposure that literally everyone in the country can see. I can raise this issue with 100 people on the street outside this building, and all 100 would say, oh yeah, that's a risk. But for some reason, we can't get serious in this body to be able to take on the same thing just to identify what are we going to do with individuals that are considered special interest aliens, are we really going to just process them at the border and release them in the country? Or are we going to enforce our own sovereignty as just about every other nation does in the world? What are we planning to do on this? I would just say, for the basic function of our national security, we should enforce our borders, and we should not just release special interest aliens out into the country, as has been done for now the last 2 years by the numbers of 70,000 plus. So I would hope this body would get serious about dealing with issues like asylum, parole, and all the different features that have been used to release these individuals into the country, that we could fix that before we have the next 9/11 in our country. One last comment, just based on news that's continued to be able to flow out. All of us are absolutely heartbroken at a hospital that had a major explosion from a rocket in Gaza. The initial reports came out just immediately. This must have been the Israelis that attacked the hospital. And many countries around the world immediately made statements that the Israelis bombed a hospital. Meetings were canceled with President Biden while he was in the region because the Israelis had bombed a hospital, until the facts and information actually came out. Now, less than 24 hours later, we have overhead that can identify the movement of different rockets that we're able to see. We have information that is now out in the public, and the president has confirmed that was not an Israeli strike on that hospital. That was a rocket that was launched from inside Gaza that went errant and then landed in Gaza directly on a hospital, killing almost 500 people. It was literally a terrorist attack on Israel that, instead of hitting innocent civilians in Israel, it hit innocent civilians in Gaza. It is still just as tragic for all of those families, but I would call on all the nations that immediately condemned Israel for attacking a hospital to immediately turn that to condemn Hamas for attacking civilians and for launching rockets to kill civilians in Israel that actually killed Palestinian civilians in Gaza. That for every nation that falsely accused Israel of this horrible attack, that they would see the evidence and they would instead turn and try to speak to Hamas to stop their terrorist attacks. That is something every nation can do, to stand up for the life and the value of people and of civilians. And I would call on them to be able to do that even today. With that, I yield the floor.